Right. So in this poem, we're going to look at it's named Epitaph of a Tyrant, and as always, we start off with the title, and we look at epitaph, and we sort of reflect on the fact that it's something written on the headstone of someone who has passed, and generally speaking, it's something nice, something that sort of remembers the time that they've spent on this planet. Now, when we look at the size of the poem and it's 6 lines, we sort of see why it's quite short because obviously you wouldn't be writing something sort of really long on an epitaph. It's generally quite brief, and even this would be sort of realistically quite long for something on a gravestone. Then when we look at the second part of the title, a tyrant, it's confusing because immediately you think, what would an epitaph of a tyrant, a cruel and oppressive sort of leader, what would it say? And there's sort of almost an irony there in the fact that you would even consider writing an epitaph for a tyrant, because generally speaking, you'd want to write something quite negative, which is the opposite of like the idea of what it's for. So when we get to the first line of the text, and we see the word perfection, again, we're still questioning how is it that a tyrant would be seen as perfect. And then we see straight away after the idea of perfect. To me, it's like the perfection for a tyrant is the idealistic way they see themselves. And we all have this sense of perfection, and it's the way we see it. But the tyrant sees it in a way that history essentially doesn't judge them kindly for. Then when it goes into perfection of a kind, we see this quite sort of initial contradiction, which I've sort of commented over here, because you can't have perfection of a kind. You're either perfect or you're not. There's got to be some sort of standard of what perfection is. When we sort of get to the idea of the fact that it's perfection of a kind, we see that it's more loosely based on the perfection of the tyrant themselves and what their perception is. And the reason it's of a kind is that we don't necessarily agree with that perfection. And then we see that the end of that line was what he was after. We get a couple of things that we need to point out. Number one, we get the idea it's a he, and I've written up here that the masculine sort of nature of this is that the tyrants in history have essentially been male. It's very rare that a tyrant or someone that we look back on really negatively in history has been female. So Auden groups them all together and says this is a very male trait. This is something that male leaders do. And obviously, in essence, at the time of the writing in the 1930s, there aren't a lot of examples of female, sort of leaders throughout history. There's some in the ancient world, but in modern times, there aren't very many political leaders that are female. When we sort of read the line altogether, perfection of a kind was what he was after. We look at the fact that that there's a desire there by the tyrant, that something that they want, more than anything in the world, and that maybe the reason why they're a tyrant is they're after this sort of perfection and maybe this respect from people, that they crave so desperately, perhaps giving a suggestion of the reason why they behave so poorly. And then we go into the second line of the poetry he invented, and we see the he was easy to understand. And I'll talk about over here this hyperbole. It was easy to understand, and the reason it's a hyperbole is, generally speaking, we don't find poetry that easy to understand. But the irony is that the tyrant gets the idea that if he can give simple messages, he can reach the masses, and that they'll understand exactly what he's trying to say. And that if he makes it too complicated, potentially the people won't understand and won't grasp onto what he's trying to say. So he simplifies it. Then we get this idea that when these simplistic views and ideologies, we get the idea that maybe the tyrant is arrogant when they use the word invented. A poet might look at a creation or a composition, and they want people to think and reflect and be critical about what they're writing. They don't want it to be easy to understand. They want to really question people and challenge people. So it's interesting how the tyrant sees that they've invented poetry. They've invented this, entire paradigm of writing, whereas, the poet doesn't see it that way. The poet feels like they're a part of it. Okay, so again, this arrogancy is given then to the tyrant, and it's not given in a positive light by Auden. Then we go on, he knew human folly, and we look at human folly here as the idea of basically, the weakness in humanity, that we ourselves maybe don't have good sense, and the people are prone to being suggested to ideas, that if the ideas are suggested well, that we might be weak enough to believe them. And when the simile is used to say he knows those like the back of his hand, there's a familiarity for him, that he understands humanity at its lowest point. Maybe not at its highest and at its best, but this tyrant knows, where the weakness is in humanity. The idea of the back of his hand too gives a bit of a violent or a bit of an aggressive sense. Like if you were going to slap someone close to you, a lot of the time, you might sort of just quickly sort of flick them with the back of your hand, and it's probably an aggressive way of sort of disciplining someone. So it's like that power and that control that the tyrant has over the people. And then it goes on to say, was greatly interested in armies and fleets. And over here, we've sort of had a little bit of a look at the fact that obviously a tyrant is interested in his armies and fleets and the armies and fleets of others so that he can ensure his victories and he can achieve that kind of perfection that he's looking for in battle. Then it goes on to, I guess, to me, the final two lines always relatively important in the context of any poem, but in a 6-line poem, the last two lines are probably even more important than general. And he's got this real, confronting idea, Auden, where he says, when he laughed, this tyrant, respectable senators burst with laughter. So when the tyrant is sort of giving an idea or thinks something is humorous or whatever they're saying, it's reflected by the people around them. So the senators laugh, so enthusiastically. They agree so enthusiastically with the ideas of the tyrant, making the tyrant feel like they are perfect and that their ideas are well received. But the reason for their laughter is not because they agreed. The reason for their laughter is the fear of opposing the tyrant. And the word respectable is interesting because, again, it's ironic because we don't respect that. We don't respect the senators not standing up to the tyrant. But to me, like the word burst really suggests that these senators are just so contrived, so fake in the manner in which they agree with the tyrant, because their fear of their own life is greater than the capacity of evil in the tyrant. The oppression and the cruelty of the tyrant is not as important to them as their own safety and their own sort of position within the world that they're existing in, which we can forgive them for, and suggest that who can blame them if they think their life's in danger. But we judge them also poorly at the same time for not standing up for what is right. And then the consequence of these senators essentially agreeing with the tyrant, giving that tyrant more power, of fueling the ideas, is that when the tyrant cried, little children died in the streets. And we see this real contrast and juxtaposition between laugh and cry, respectable, little, really small, insignificant, laughter and die. Laughing is just a little bit of a fun and easy thing to do, whereas the consequence on the other side is fatal. Death is as final as it can be. We see some of the ideas here, like the idea of little. To me, the person on the street too, the streets, just the working class, insignificant. I think I've written here somewhere marginalised, sort of people within our society, the voiceless. This is where the tyrant's impact is at its most fatal. It's not with the senators who laugh along. It's more with the people that can't sort of stand up against the tyrant's sort of ability. So when we look at the poem overall, we sort of see that it's more than likely a poem referring to Adolf Hitler. Auden was living in Berlin during the 1930s and would have bore witness to Hitler's rise to power. I don't think, though, he mentions Hitler because he wants his poem to be broader than that. He mentions the idea of he because he wants to sort of show the people that are reading his poem that these are the same capabilities, the same skills, qualities, and capacity that every tyrant in the past had. It's going to be true of the tyrants of the present, which potentially are people like Hitler and maybe even he's thinking about Mussolini in Italy. And these are going to be the examples of what the tyrants of the future believe. And if we apply this, to people who have come after that, like Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, or even currently Kim Jong Un in North Korea, we see that potentially some of the elements of being a tyrant are true, no matter what time you are judging that part of history. When he says makes that commentary, the commentary then too is that the consequence of the tyrant could be potentially sort of slowed down by those who have power, other politicians, other people of influence, but they choose not to do that, and that the consequence is on the people. But there's a little bit of a criticism of the people as well there when he talks about the idea of human folly, and the idea of the poetry being easy to understand, that we get sucked into the simplicity of messages and the simplicity of ideas. And we've seen it in our own country in Australia where, stop the boats, protect the borders, these sort of really easy slogans that are used by, the Liberal political party in our country win them elections. So again, like the commentary that Auden makes is not sort of suppressed into just this one area of the 1930s that he refers to. The message is far broader than that. Okay, so hopefully you've gotten something out of that, and you can just write down a few notes, and then sort of just get a bit of a sense of what that poem is about. Thanks.